To begin with, I just want to explain something about the research. So what I'll be talking about today is research that I conducted with my colleagues with over 50 Scottish Muslims from a variety of ages and backgrounds. Okay. And this was a group of people who, for the most part, were saying that they had really positive experiences, both with police and also in the wider community. But what emerged was a consistent story of experiences at airports and encounters with airport authorities that were perceived to be illegitimate, that were humiliating, and sometimes were inciting real fear in people. So why is this relevant to today's discussion about young people in police? Well, I'd say for two reasons. One, of course, young people are part of communities. And two, there are times when we actually really rely on people's communities and their social networks and so on. You know, particularly times like now for Muslim youth, where we rely on their communities to exercise a positive influence and a moderating kind of influence. And so what we're finding in our research is that airports are providing a set of experiences that are uniting young and old, a set of experiences that are saying that Muslims really are regarded as dangerous others, and a set of experiences that are saying that, at least from the perspective of airport authorities, there really is a sense of them and us. And so this then we suggest may be having consequences for the kind of influence that can be exercised within Muslim communities. Okay, so what is it that when I mean by a Muslim airport story? Well, I'm talking about a story that's widely shared and instantly recognised. And I'll let you read through, some of the elements of that story. And as you're reading through those elements, you might be thinking, well, actually, that's something that impacts on all of us. It's a necessary inconvenience that's about the current national security threat. And in part, that's true, but for Muslims, the experience is qualitatively different. And it's different because of the way in which it communicates something about people's belonging and something about the way in which their Muslim identity is regarded. So one of the things is that for everybody there, when they have negative encounters at airports, and it doesn't matter if it's home or abroad, it's distressing. But there's something particularly distressing about it when it happens at home. And it's distressing precisely because with our participants, they felt strongly British. They were strongly identified as British, as Scottish. They felt strongly committed. And as this young man says, when I arrive home and you don't recognise me as Scottish, well, who am I now? Okay, and so this is something actually that we know from the wider social psychological research, that actually it's when we identify, when we care, that we are most hurt and most vulnerable to be hurt. The second thing is, and it's the flip side of this, is that when Muslims are in airports, their experience is that they are seen as one thing and one thing only, and that is Muslim. But it's a particular kind of Muslim. It's one who is other, who is dangerous. And the people who we were speaking with were people who were actually very proud also of their Muslim identity. They saw it as a source of morality, and they actually saw it as something that made them good British citizens. And so it becomes a double kind of like misrecognition and something that is doubly distressing for people. So both of these things, this experience of not being seen as you see yourself, and so not being able to act on your sense of self, is part of what makes these kinds of negative encounters in airports humiliating. There are some other aspects too that people frequently mentioned. One of them is the way in which, being pulled aside and questioned and so on is often done in a very public way, which for all of us is uncomfortable. But if you're Muslim, it's experienced as inviting other people to look at you as you're the terrorist, because there is the awareness of people's fear of the terrorist threat. The other aspect of it is this experience of real powerlessness, that it doesn't matter what you say, I know that in this context I can't ask questions and I can't complain. So the question is, does this matter, or is this just a lot of hurt feelings that we can't really do anything about? Well, I just want to share with you some of the things that we've looked at in terms of the consequences. So in common with all of the research on procedural justice, there was that people were talking about lying, withholding information, withholding cooperation, and so on. So here we have an older member of the community who's actually been working very closely with the police for years around counter-terrorism and other things in terms of, representing his community. And he was starting to become incredibly frustrated and very distressed and very angry. And it was all about the experiences he was having at the airport, where he was not being recognised as, where he was kind of like not being recognised as he saw himself. And so he was talking about withdrawing his support from the police. We also have, a wider kind of like set of consequences, though, that sometimes we don't think about. So, for instance, people talked about not being able to act in pro-social ways. If you don't see me as a citizen, and I can't trust that you will see my good citizenship behaviour in those terms, then that limits the ability, my ability to act in an emergency, for instance. Another thing people talked about was being able to now understand young men's rage. There were also the more kind of like subtle effects. I mean, this young man was interesting because he was actually, your pin-up boy for, respectfulness and so on. And he was actually quite critical of a lot of fellow Muslims for not being more prepared to accept inconvenience for national security objectives. He was very concerned about national security. But that actually made him even angrier towards the airport authorities, who he saw as incompetent and lacking moral authority because of the way in which he had treated his grandmother and people like her. And then this is also very important because there were quite a lot of people in, a number of people in our sample who were exercising leadership within their communities. And what they were saying was, look, when I know these are the kinds of experiences that I and other Muslims are having, these humiliating experiences, it becomes that much harder for me to speak out and for me to say, look, trust the authorities and cooperate. So, what can be done? Well, I'm not going to stand here and suggest that we're going to turn airports into Gardens of Eden. Obviously, there are all kinds of constraints in airports, and they're not particularly pleasant places to be for any of us. I am, however, suggesting that what we need to do is turn our analytic gaze on our policies and our practices in airports to ensure that they're fit for purpose, so that they're actually doing the job that they're meant to be doing and that they are keeping us safe. And so I've just put some guiding principles here. Actually, in Scotland, the Scottish Police Force has taken these things on board and is working at Edinburgh and Glasgow Airport and with their local Muslim communities to try to address some of these issues. So it is possible to do it. And in keeping with what the previous speakers spoke about, the kinds of things that we need to do is get better at differentiating between good and bad, and making sure that people do feel that they are one of us, whether it's British, whether it's Americans, whether it's simply decent citizens with a right and a legitimate reason for being in airports. And then all of those kinds of issues and those principles around procedural justice are, of course, important. And I think critically giving meaningful voice to Muslims around the whole issue of airports, I think, is something that we need to do. Okay, thank you very much.